So hi everyone, welcome. It's 4:05 in Chicago and 3:05 where I am, so I'm getting always confused at this point. My name is Jazz Brooks, and I'm an organizer for this series. I'm a PhD student at U Chicago focusing on smell and taste technologies, and I'm really excited to kick off this sporadic online series dubbed Sentient Cinema. So the series is meant to be an opportunity to experience scented films throughout history, and who knows, maybe new ones in the future, as well as provide a venue for people interested in olfactory art or research to hang out and connect. On that note, as people are already doing, please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and talk amongst each other, and especially do feel free to comment on the smells that we're going to all be experiencing together. There's a reason why we're in this format and not in kind of like a panelist format instead. I will ask people to, however, make sure that they stay muted throughout this so that we can highlight the screening as well as the panel discussion that's following. Now, we have nearly 250 people registered from over 20 countries. So a big thank you for everyone that's registered and those that are currently attending. There's 127 people, which is quite terrifying for me. I'm happy that I'm not an auditorium and we're online instead. And that means a lot to me. And additionally, a huge thank you to U Chicago Grad Council and Cinerama Inc. for supporting the event. Today's kind of serve as a pilot for the series, so pardon any kind of Zoom compression. Feedback is happily welcomed afterwards, or if there's anyone who's really familiar with like online streaming services, please do talk to me. And before we get started with the screening, some background information. So A Tale of Old Whiff first premiered back in 1960, accompanying the cinematic release of Scent of Mystery. So both of them were written specifically for Hans Loeb's smell-o-vision technology in mind. Unfortunately, after Scent of Mystery's mixed reception, smell-o-vision technology kind of faded away from cinemas. In fact, the short film we'll be watching today was thought to be lost over the last 50 years approximately. A few years back, when Randy Gitsch and David Strohmeyer remastered The Scent of Mystery, they hoped to actually append A Tale of Old Whiff as an extra, but it was nowhere to be found in the Cinerama vault. It was only when their entire collection, hundreds and hundreds of film cans, were moved and deposited in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Hollywood, was each and every can meticulously reviewed, and bam, in 2016, film archivist Andrew Bradburn came across a small roll of 70 millimeter acetate film with only cartoon scribbled on a label. That's pretty amazing. And so it was rediscovered and soon restored by David and Randy, and a big thank you to both of you for doing that. But even with the film rediscovered, a principal component remained lost, which was its original odors. And today we also have the pleasure to be experiencing that thanks to Tammy Bernstock's huge efforts over the course of history at this point. This has been amazing. And her team, including Neil Harris and Michelle French, interpreting the film's original odor descriptions and reviving them in the form of a scratch and sniff card that we were able to mail to everyone that was participating. So if you're interested in more information on why Scented Cinema came about, I would especially recommend one of our panelists' thesis, dissertation, Professor Catherine Klepper, and she's with us today, so you can ask questions afterwards. And if you're curious about smell-o-vision and its inventor, Hans Loeb, or the production and the reception of it, I'd recommend the spectacular scented documentary, Inglorious Smell-o-Vision by Tammy Bernstock and John Anderson. We also have in our audience the children of Hans Loeb and Mike Todd Jr., as well as a number of artists, researchers, and developers. So this is going to be a very, very fun discussion. So as John Anderson puts it, when it comes to cinema, why not the nose? Now, 60 years later after its original release, we now present to you A Tale of Old Whiff. Okay, I think we're at the point where we can move into our panel discussion format. So thank you everyone for joining us. Now that we've watched a short film, we're moving into this section where you can feel free to ask a bunch of questions in the Q&A. The chat's going incredibly fast, so yeah, it might be hard for us to catch everyone's questions. I'm excited to be joined today by Professor Leslie Kay, Professor Catherine Klepper, Professor Scott Wolniak, and Tammy Bernstock. I'll be quickly reading through everyone's bios, which I think is like a tradition in these kinds of events. So Professor Leslie Kay is a professor of psychology and has been at the University of Chicago since 2000. Her laboratory studies olfactory and limbic system neurophysiology, focusing on the mechanisms and functions associated with intra and interregional oscillatory cooperativity. Professor Kay did her dissertation research in the laboratory of Walter J. Freeman at the University of California, Berkeley, and received her PhD in biophysics in 1995. She then had her postdoctoral research in the laboratory of Gilles Laurent at the California Institute of Technology, where she studied olfactory bulb mitral cell responses to changes in odor context. Professor Catherine Klepper is an assistant professor of practice at Rutgers University and the P3 Collaboratory. Professor Klepper received her PhD in screen cultures from Northwestern University and wrote her phenomenal dissertation, The Rigged House, Gimmickry, Exhibition, and Embodied Spectatorship in Mid-Century American Moviegoing in 2016 on mid-century, multisensory, cinematic gimmicks such as smell-o-vision, aromarama, and sense-around. Additionally, she works as a research consultant for the Interviews and Oral History of Television, which was formerly known as the Archive of American Television. And then Professor Scott Wolniak is a multidisciplinary artist, teacher, and occasional curator based in Chicago, working in a variety of media, including drawing, sculpture, and animation. His work uses often humor and phenomenology to present everyday life within a cosmic context. So Professor Wolniak utilizes the open-ended theatrical modes of landscape and the artist studio to produce relational work, which range from opulent fields to cartoonish figuration. And he began teaching his teaching career at the School of the University of Chicago in 2002. Since then, he's taught across media, developing curriculum for classes such as conceptual drawing, collage, and experimental animation. I know a lot of people that have talked about Professor Wolniak's animation class, so this is exciting to hear about and to kind of finally meet you. Professor Wolniak also won the Jane L. M. Mural Award for Excellence in Pedagogy in 2014. And then Tammy Bernstock is a writer, director, and immersive event producer and scented storyteller. She has experience in the screen-based industry, which includes 12 years in the children's department of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, aka ABC, where Tammy originated and executive produced the award-winning online gateway, The Playground. Since her film school thesis, Attempts to Record Smell for the Cinema from 1986, Tammy's twin fascination with scent and cinema continues. She recently initiated the groundbreaking olfactory restorations of the first and last smell-o-vision films, The Scent of Mystery and A Tale of Old Whiff. Scent of Mystery was then presented in participatory smell-o-vision for the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, UK, as well as for the Danish Film Institute in Copenhagen and for the TCM Classic Film Festival in Hollywood. Most recently, she co-directed and produced Inglorious Smell-o-Vision, a scented documentary film that sheds light on the technology's history and its inventor, Hans Loeb. So it's a pleasure to have you all here with such complementary and fantastic backgrounds that I think is going to really excite people to talk about. I'm seeing a lot of chat still, which is really intimidating. Let's just like break the ice a bit by first asking, is there anything about the film that stood out to you, experiencing it with smell? So if we want to start off with, let's say, Leslie, if you want to go first, then Catherine, Scott, and Tammy.
Yeah, for me, the first time I watched it, I didn't get the association of the bone with the case that it was in. So the scent was very confusing to me. And somebody pointed that out in the chat, and I went, oh, of course, it smells exactly like a leather case. And so that really brings out how hard it is to identify an odor without knowing the context of it. And we do this in the lab all the time. I bring in scents for the students and their common scents like chocolate and vanilla and things like this. And people are really terrible at identifying them. But once you see the label, you say to yourself, oh, of course, that's what it smells like. So this was, sort of a continuous experience of that, and the use of context to kind of bootstrap the perception, which is much of what we study in the lab.
Who was next, Jazz? I've forgotten.
Yeah, sorry, I'll be more direct. Catherine?
All right, let me unmute myself. Yeah, so this is my third or fourth time watching this. I was so excited when it was rediscovered because when I was writing my dissertation, it was still lost to the world. But a couple of things that were sort of on my mind this go around. I put in the chat that the animator of this film, John Hubley, is well known in sort of visual studies and animation studies world for his work with UPA and some other kind of popular creations of his, like Gerald McBoing Boing and Mr. Magoo. And I was just thinking how funny it is that Mr. Magoo is functionally blind, and here we have Old Whiff, who's kind of functionally smell blind until trained otherwise, and it's kind of a lost. It was sort of a lost opportunity. That the other thing that stuck out to me this go around is how the film really kind of lays plain what it means to kind of see with your nose, which of course is a theme of the larger feature that this short accompanied, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about how scent functions in this sort of larger film, Scent of Mystery, that this was developed in tandem with. But it's similarly kind of a detective story where the olfactory clues are the ones that solve the case.
Scott?
Hi. So I thought it would be interesting to watch the animation without smelling for the first time through. And so I could just kind of consider it as an animation and then watch it again with the addition of the smell. So I thought it was interesting how it aligns itself with a lot of animation from that era, which kind of used smell as a gag, and the idea of relationship of sort of smell to various characters. And so just thinking about the idea that, smell was a really common, or sort of bad smells was a common kind of gag in cartoons around this time, so we could think of like Pee-wee from the Popeye cartoons, sleepwalking, following the smell of cooking hamburgers, or, any number of things. Pepe Le Pew is a character. So it's definitely a trope within animation, especially from this era. And then when adding the scratch and sniff card, I found that in some ways, I think this kind of gets at some of the things maybe we'll talk about later, but some of the kind of challenges logistically with kind of smell-o-vision, and just the idea that once I started interacting with the card, that was in some ways a distraction from the animation, because I'm kind of wrestling with it to, look for the number, scratch off the right ones, keep the smells kind of, and then the smells start to kind of interact with each other on the card as well. So I guess that was my first impression, just thinking about the real, the quality of the animation and ways that it kind of worked pretty well as an animation. And then there's certainly a sensory layer that's added. But I guess one other thing related to that is I was thinking about with kind of live action or photographic, film, there can be a visceral quality to images, but that is lost with animation because we're already sort of mediating further, and it's this kind of stylized graphic version. So yeah, just a few impressions of mine.
Tammy?
Okay, so I don't know, I've got so much to say about this, but this film really encapsulates a lot of the kind of philosophy that I've got with cinema and smell and moving forward. Just in relation to the question, okay, so the smells in here, I focus, so Neil Harris from Scent Events, Saskia's just left, but Saskia from the Institute for Art and Olfaction and Neil Harris have been long-term collaborators on scented cinema projects, and we've explored a whole variety of different ways of propagating scent. So that goes to your question, pronunciation, I'm sorry, but Maya, other smells in theatre where it's not muddled. I'll talk about your question in a minute. And also Paola, the sense of each and the associations with each sense. I've noted that question. So the two smells that we focused on in particular in this that weren't just kind of obvious things like chocolate and you know, cut grass and bubble bath, were the smell of bone and the smell of field of flowers, because they were the two key smells in this film that lifted it above a gimmick for me. So bone was a clue. So with Whiff, we were trying to smell bone, and bone was a challenge. Neil Harris ended up making bone, and I'd love if he'd talk to that. But I initially went to the CSIRO. There was someone at the museum, the Children's Museum, who happened to have a dinosaur bone that was there at the museum. So I was allowed to hold it and smell it, which was very exciting. And then I got him involved in thinking about what a dinosaur bone from that period would smell like. So there was kind of a lot of background scientific research, but then in the end, we went with something that was more, and then Saskia also worked on bone for a while. Like it's complex, and as you say, it's like, where does the bone sit? Has it been in soup? Has it been in a dusty cupboard? You know, buried. But bone was an interesting one because it's a clue. It's not just a spot effect. And the other one was Field of Flowers. So I really wanted Neil to work on Field of Flowers, which was number 7. Mainly because to me that was like you know, a beautiful twist in the narrative, in that, you know, instead of sending Whiff back to the pound, you know, the detective taught Whiff how to smell, and suddenly we were in this kind of really Fantasia. It was the same period, and Disney wanted to actually put scent on Fantasia. So there's this kind of whole first smelling experience for the dog that I wanted the audience to smell with. So, you know, Scratch and Sniff was very much done as a way so that we can share the film in virtually and easily and inexpensively in a cinema. But, you know, the documentary Inglorious Smell-O-Vision explores kind of all the different ways that we propagated smell in the cinema, from big atmospheric smells to small personal sprays, which I think are a really good way of not muddling smells, because you're spraying just in your area and it's much more direct than the scratching thing, which gets, you know, someone said that they smelt cut grass and chocolate. That's because they're sitting next to each other on the card, and in the envelope they probably got muddled. And so this is, you know, to me this is kind of a compromise, but it makes it portable and possible. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested to follow up with me about, you know, obviously I'm very excited about scent and cinema, so anyone can get in contact with me, and I'd love to talk to you more about the details of stuff, and also you know, put you in touch with the people who actually develop the smells. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you all. So it sounds like our first line of inquiry is going to be actually this translation from the original format to the Scratch and Sniff format, I think is something that's important here. So for context for people that are currently watching, Smell-O-Vision was a technology where odors kind of just appeared in the theater and then left afterwards. There was no necessary participatory element of this. And that brings up a question of the tensions between a need for like diegetic cues for the visual side to know what the object is, and as well questions of drawing our attention to smell. So Leslie, I was wondering if you could just like give a couple thoughts about the idea of visual attention distracting from odor, and your thoughts on like scratch and sniff in this context.
Yeah, so I think the scratch and sniff actually is a really nice way to direct attention to odor, because, you know, we smell lots of odors in the environment, and we often don't smell them. I mean, we're not conscious of them, and it's not until, you know, our attention is called to them that we actively sniff them and actively take them in. And in fact, during sniffing, the way that odors are delivered to the olfactory receptors is quite different than just breathing. And it's incidental during just breathing, and during active sniffing, you can actually direct olfactory attention to odors. You know, we did an experiment where we had rats pick out compounds from mixtures and identify which mixtures they were in, and they sniff differently depending on the chemical properties of the odors, depending on how easily they absorb into the mucus over the receptors. And so sniffing is a really special thing. So I think that, you know, on the one hand, it's nice to have it just ambiently in the theater, but I think a lot of people aren't going to smell it that way, or they'll just be annoyed, and then everything mixes together and you have to have really high airflow. So in this case, I think the visual attention is really important because it directs the olfactory attention to an object. The field of flowers, now you might want to take away visual attention from the object, because running through a field of flowers is a much more, whole body ambient odor experience, whereas sniffing a bone or finding a clue, it's directed, it's at an object. So I think there's, kind of where the tension is between them.
Catherine, I was curious if you would be interested in jumping in on this from a perspective of like different ways that scent has been presented.
Well, I mean, there's a lot I could say about kind of different historical phases or movements of integrating scent into theatrical, specifically cinematic exhibition space. I mean, I think the question that you put to Leslie about diegesis or the story world is a really interesting one, because of course cinemas are highly regulated and sort of they're highly policed spaces in terms of senses and how attention is focused, right? They're dim for a reason. They're dim so that the light of the screen captures you, right? The velvet curtains around the screen are not just there to kind of display opulence, they're there to dampen sound, right? So that incidental noise is not greater than the sort of directed noise of the soundtrack. And so I think smell poses a unique challenge in that how do you kind of boost signal and dampen noise, which are the, Axe body spray, popcorn, all the scents that people are bringing into the theater with them that are not part of the story world. So that's one of the sort of diegetic challenges, is how to just amplify the narrative sense so that they're comprehensible within theatrical space. And then there's also the question of like, where is movie space? Where is the diegesis? Does it reside on the screen, or is it in the room of the theater? Because what I think many people enjoy about going to the movies is this feeling of a dream space, losing yourself, forgetting your sort of corporeal being, and, just existing in some sort of observational listening capacity. So when you're brought back to the sort of seat you sit in by virtue of these smells surrounding you, it can be a counter narrative device. It can remind you of your reality when the pleasures of moviegoing are often based in sort of unreality and fantasy. So there's all sorts of tensions between sort of diegesis and non-diegesis when it comes to adding scent. And I'm sure Tammy has a ton of thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, can I step in there? Because I do feel like we're at another kind of pivotal point in history. And I really fear for movies in the theatre, because I think people are getting so used to now watching at home that, I mean, my feeling is that, like, I guess like in, when television was first invented, that, and you've written a lot about this kind of historically, now's the time that, when we feel safe, that we can get together in a space. And we've had a touch of that today, sharing the experience, which adds to it. And in the past, I guess, going to the movies was that total absorption. But now I feel like it almost has to be participatory, or, why go? I mean, or at least for a while till we get back to that sense of going and sitting with other people eating popcorn noisily. But, I think for me, this kind of makes it more performative and participatory. But it does, of course, mean that you have to be really selective about which films need smell and which films should be presented in it. It's not like every film should have a smell track. I'm not ever saying that. I think it's very specific and, targeted towards certain materials that cry out for it. But I really love that sense of sharing and, what did you smell? Like, what was that? Because it's part of awakening that sense that it's just so underrated for me. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I'm lagging a bunch on my end, my video, but Scott, would you be interested in responding to this? And I also have just a general question, which is, this was in some sense a commercial piece, doing like a large scale experimental like activity to some extent, the original Smell-O-Vision one, as well as the current one with Scratch and Sniff. Did you have any thoughts about this? Sorry, poorly asked question.
I do think it's really interesting as an experimental project, because the animation follows. And I think within the animation itself too, there's a moment of kind of a shift away from maybe a kind of more commercial or conventional kind of stylistic trend from that time period. And then sort of a referencing or an acknowledging of kind of contemporary directions and sort of new directions of avant-garde art at that time. And that is particularly when he has when Whiff has his awakening, and the sort of psychedelic quality of that scene, which I really, really enjoyed. So just thinking about sort of it being kind of this kind of commercial form or style, but then there's a kind of referencing to things like the films of Stan Brakhage or other kinds of experimental work from that time. I really like what was said about the kind of parallel experiences between the kind of immersive sort of full absorption into the kind of illusion of the film, and then the kind of social aspect of sitting in the theater, maybe like side chatter that is happening, you know, the just interacting with people that sitting around, or sort of the kind of collective response to the film. So I think that that's a really important part of sort of imagining how this might have been or felt at the time in the theater. And everybody kind of, kind of comparing notes and sort of talking about not just the film, but the experiences happening with the smells as well. But I think that there's a really interesting question about sort of facilitation of the experience that sort of this also brings up. So if there is to be like a secondary kind of component or physical element, like the scratch and sniff card or something else that is sort of where the audience members are acknowledging you know, how they're receiving the smells versus the completely sort of seamless immersion where the smells just kind of appear and, you know, appropriately in relation to imagery. I actually think that it starts to kind of tap into aspects of virtual reality that we sort of thinking more and more about these days, and sort of feel like how can a kind of illusory experience, immersion in a kind of space be completely immersive and sort of seamless. And I think it starts to kind of tap into elements of, because I think the question too about like gimmickry or like where does this fit within kind of sort of larger structures, it almost feels like it maybe is geared more towards like the amusement park experience. I was thinking about examples from like Harry Potter world or something, where there's a lot of that kind of like layers of sort of sensory input that are sort of being kind of blended by the in the space by the audience.
Well, I mean, Disney has an ongoing interest in scent, and you know, and I mean, people who've been to Disneyland would have experienced some of the rides that do incorporate scent into them, I'm sure, or you know, and even I think they've even got these, I can't remember the names of them now, but they pump out the smell of the donuts and the Disney kind of sweet smell into the streets as well. They've got like there's a whole layer of scent, which is, and they've just passed a whole new patent. So I think Disney's right into scent, but certainly, you know, increasingly, I think most immersive experiences that are pitched incorporate a scent element of some kind, because I think that there was a comment, I'm trying to keep up with all the chat at the same time as what people are saying. It's also interesting, but you know, the kind of haptics and you know, this whole kind of idea that we're not going to be looking at flat screens and that we need to be totally immersed. And I think people realize, you know, like pretty much anyone you mention smell to that go into that discussion about, oh, how closely it's associated with memory. Like, I think it's very much on the tip of everyone's consciousness. And and increasingly we're moving into that space as I suppose experiences become, you know, less two-dimensional altogether, that we're all looking for something more immersive. And I think sense has become like a vital part of all of that, and which is exciting for all of us people who work in the area, because suddenly it's becoming more mainstream. You know, you get that when there's a wave. That's how I'm feeling anyway.
Yeah, which kind of begs the question of, you know, how close do the odors have to be real, right? So if you want to make an immersive experience, and this is something people have been asking for probably centuries, but at least decades. And there's a recent paper from Noam Sobel's lab. I don't know if people have seen it, but first author is Ravia, and where they've created what they claim are olfactory metamers. So they've mapped odor space using machine learning, 21 different physical chemical properties of odors and very complex mixtures, and are able to predict a novel mixture that will smell like a mixture in that odor, in that 21-dimensional space, that doesn't contain any of the chemicals that the original mixture smells like. So they're able to say, you know, here's chocolate and here's all the chemicals that we know smell like chocolate. We can make a chocolate scent that doesn't contain any of those chemicals, and people can't tell it apart. And so, you know, I think this, if it plays out, you know, in kind of a technological level, really opens the door to having a panel on the front of your computer that could waft odors at you, and make things smell, you know, pretty real, as long as I think you have the visual or sound component to cue the person enough to make them take that as the smell.
So I'm going to jump in, and yes, I would recommend everyone that's here to definitely check out that paper. It's been posted in the chat as well. One thing I want to address, and I think people are kind of hitting on in the chat as well, is the cards themselves, right? Because it's not just visual or scent itself, it's the design of the card, it's the design of the capturing of the odor. So I guess I'm going to go into like a couple fragmented questions. So first, I'm gonna hit up Tammy first. Thank you. What were some considerations when producing the odor, like the cards themselves, so the layout, as well as the odors? So choosing them, how did you choose them, or things like that? You already touched this a bit.
Yes. So so for both films, Scent of Mystery and Tale of Old Whiff, we didn't have the original formulations. And so in both cases, and also there were a lot more smells in both films. Like it was really like there was something like 40 in Scent of Mystery for a feature, and there were 15 original smells in Tale of Old Whiff. So it was kind of a matter of looking back at the films and I guess interpreting them, thinking about what might be interesting. Like just briefly to go to a Scent of Mystery, you know, we had things like they had this, it was all shot in Spain, and they had the running of the bulls. And we just thought that would be an interesting smell for an atmosphere. We wanted to have like a mixture of atmosphere, spot effects, and plot related things. So in that instance, it was Saskia Wilson-Brown was the scent producer, and we worked together to work out kind of, you know, in terms of the audience experience, what would be most interesting and exciting. So it was a reinterpretation. Also, the film had been, you know, Dave Strohmeyer. It was a new version of the film, A Holiday in Spain. So, you know, we weren't purists. And so it was about the audience experience and giving them a range of experiences that would stay true to the film. And also, you know, and I think I mentioned, you know, a retro feeling, like we wanted to also make the smells of the time. So we, you know, we took, actually Luca Turin suggested, you know, Bow perfume Antonio as the smell of the Scent of Mystery, because it was kind of a big, bold, feminine, retro smell. So, you know, we interpreted the film through the smells. So I don't know, that's a more general kind of approach. In the Tale of Old Whiff, well, you know, Michelle French, who worked also on the film in motion graphics, I think is still here. She designed the card, and we just wanted it to be, visual clues so that it could go across language and you know, maybe also accessibility. So we wanted to make it visual for the actual scratch and sniff. So there were clues there, because one of the things we discovered when we did the pilot for the re-screening of the Scent of Mystery, we kept all the smells a mystery, and people didn't have a clue. And in some ways you kind of need to contextualize smells because they come at you thick and fast, and it's quite hard. So I think giving people kind of clues about what they're going to smell is quite useful, because yeah, I mean, we're not sophisticated as much with scent at the moment. And so I think you just need to give people some clues. So that was part of the design of having the pictures on the card. We chose 8 because that's what you could fit on a card this side. And also we didn't feel like any more, you know, any more than that would have just been too much in the length of the film. And so we just, like you would have seen there was things like pine, you know, at the beginning of that Whiff's Awakening, there are other smells in there, like, you know, Christmas tree, pine smell, which would have been easy to do, but we just had to make some choices about 8 smells on the card. What else? Yeah, we wanted to have a range of things that were important, but, you know, I think you know, someone was talking about rain, and it's so hard to capture rain. I mean, I think if I was doing it again, I might not even do rain as in this way, because it's just really hard to get, because it just depends what it's raining on. You know, if it's raining on New York streets or in a back garden in Melbourne where you grew up, it's going to smell different. So there are certain smells that are just really hard to capture if they're more complex. Design of the card, did I talk about that enough? And then obviously we just used images from the film, you know, and we wanted to show, you know, do justice to this funny, quirky film.
Yeah, so on that note, I'm going to jump to Catherine really quickly. So in the history of scented cinema, it seems to be always motivated by first the deodorization of spaces. Do you see parallels in this in microencapsulation technology? And do you have any thoughts about this? Kind of like the idea of capturing odor instead of deodorizing odor.
Idea of capturing odor instead of deodorizing odor. Well, like I said, you have to have a sort of deodorized space in order to sort of then recode odor within context. And I just put a question for Leslie in the chat, because I'm honestly quite curious on how much kind of context, whether it's audio visual cues or just some other kind of, I guess, cognitive trigger, people actually need to identify a scent. You know, if there was an off-screen scent that, you know, was not queued up in any other modality, could people actually successfully identify it? I think is a big question.
I think you'd have to have somebody go, oh, what's that smell? Or, oh, what's that smell? You know, I mean, you'd have to do it with a tone of voice or give some, you know, a picture of something. And, you know, with identifying things, just the word of what it is will make somebody go, oh yeah, of course, it smells like chocolate. Where before that, they had no idea what it was. So, you know, the context depends on the context, I guess.
Yeah, and given what you just shared about, like, it doesn't even have to be chocolate.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of interesting to think about how we can encapsulate smells in ways that are legible and like kind of chemically legible, but also narratively legible. So these are some of the things I'm sort of parsing from your question, because admittedly, I don't know the state of microencapsulation of smells. So maybe you could share a little bit more with our group about where that technology is at the moment.
All I know is that there's the scratch and sniff, and then there's another kind that's sort of a lift a sticker kind of thing where you don't have to scratch it, so you get a more stable smell. I'd have to look up where that comes from, but it stays longer, so it doesn't wear off. So yeah.
Sorry. One of the interesting things about viewing Whiff in this way with the scratch and sniff card, which is delightful and portable and all the great things that Tammy explained, is that it's very different than the sort of smell-o-vision system as it was developed, which had a much more kind of global address to the audience, right? There was actually an additional magnetic code running along the soundtrack, a smell track, which Tammy mentioned earlier, that would speak to a distribution device that would then, you know, activate vials of scent and an atomizer system underneath the floorboards of the auditorium. So this is a much more sort of privatized system of scent delivery than the way the format was initially visioned, which was a more public sort of shared, you know, scent cloud experience. So I do think that because of varying levels of sensitivity to smell, which has been brought up in the chat, and just other kinds of aesthetic concerns, the sort of private delivery system does have appeals that the more public delivery system that smell-o-vision sort of historically represents does not. And it also is probably logistically an easier or more successful delivery system. But yeah. I'll let the engineers speak to that point.
And also, but there are so many different systems. In fact, Jazz, you're quite an expert on the whole scratch and sniff area too, because that's an area that you're researching. You should.
Oh yeah, I guess I can jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Nadia Berenstein, who's also in the audience, might be interested in saying stuff. If you're there, Nadia, feel free to say something. But the idea of like scratch and sniff came about first, I think through 3M or something like that, as a technology for creating carbon copies. So if anyone remembers those pieces of paper where you would stack them and then there'd be a yellow paper on the back, you would write. And essentially, the paper was already impregnated with a particular compound, and the back of the paper that you were writing on would have capsules in it that would release a compound that would then react and create a trace. So it would copy your paper when you're writing it, and you would have a copy when you split it off afterwards. But it was then used later on in kind of like, they thought, oh, fragrances can use this. And so there were fragrances houses that experimented with it in the 60s for magazine advertisements, being like, oh, just sample our perfume through our magazine. And later, infamously, as people probably have already mentioned like 3 times, I'm going to unmute Nadia in a second and have her join in for a bit. People are probably already familiar with John Waters' Polyester, infamous piece of work with the artifact of the scratch and sniff, thereby like translating it from a static kind of technology in some sense to something that was synchronized with time, and using this technology that creates basically small spheres of fragrance oils that would then be ruptured to be released later down the line. And 1 second, I'm going to unmute Nadia because I think of everyone, of like, she's beyond me on this one also. She knows this way better. So I'm gonna ask to unmute. Let's see if that works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Nadia. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. I can't turn on my, I think you have to let me turn on my video too.
Yes, let me get on that. I will make you a co-host. And now you should be able to turn on your video.
Oh, yes, here it is. Great.
And...
yeah, actually, everything that you just said about scratch and sniff and sorry, let me get this on the right screen so I'm not like looking up into space. And the like scent samples that are included in magazines, that's all news to me. I don't know very much about this and I am eager to learn more. The stuff that I know that I've done some research on is actually microencapsulation and how encapsulation technologies were applied to flavor. Starting in it really caught on or was kind of developed during the Second World War as an almost like accidental offshoot of like vacuum dehydrators that were being used to turn perishable goods like milk and eggs into imperishable powders that could be part of the kind of military canteen, the new kind of like military diet of foods, MREs and foods that could last forever. And essentially these new kind of like big dehydrating machines were applied to creating encapsulated flavors that combined volatile flavor molecules, that were able to combine volatile flavor molecules in these like these kind of microcapsules of gums, starches, and resins. And like I think of it as a technology of time, right, or a preservative technology, which is I think something that's really interesting, thinking about how the scratch and how its application in scratch and sniff also kind of interacts with the temporality of film, right? Because one of the big problems with flavor and scent and these kinds of anything that depends upon our perception of volatiles is that volatile molecules are like in the wind and they're unstable and they oxidize and they change and they vanish and they diminish. And part of the problem for food producers in the flavor industry, right, was figuring out, if they're investing all of this money in kind of the development of flavor additives and kind of optimizing flavors for senses, how do you make sure that that product like kind of reaches the consumer and is able to like develop its, deliver its full flavor payload? And they do talk about it in terms of payload in the 50s and 60s, like using this Cold War military term, to like the senses of the consumer at the moment of consumption. So it's really about like preserving this like ephemeral kind of like matter of sensation and deploying it at the right time, and preserving it from any of the kind of changes that would be expected to take place. And so, I mean, in a way, it's kind of like an interesting counterexample to the way that this plays out in like the temporal unrolling of watching.
My friend Tammy. Roy.
Oh, I see. I think someone is.
Your Megan, you've got your mute. You've unmuted yourself, Megan.
All good. I muted Megan. I'm sorry, Megan. You were saying, Nadia?
Australia is
that was
morning in Australia. We're getting on with our lives. It's not.
Yeah.
Good morning in the future. Australia, you are where we're gonna be. Yeah, that was basically all I wanted to say. But I am like, this was such a fun event, and I'm so interested in kind of the techniques of making scratch and sniff now. And I think as we were kind of first starting,
that it's also a cost thing. Like to do the stickers that we did is like so much cheaper, because we looked into it a lot, and this is all self-financed. Like there is no money in smell at the moment. So, you know, I have to kind of also say that, you know, there's a lot of compromise that has to happen at the moment until, like, I'm not very good at the whole funding aspect. I'm fascinated by smell, but, you know, the stickers means that you can print up the cards and do them. And you know, this is, you know, this film is kind of like an introduction, a bit of fun. Like I totally agree that the stuff they use for the you know, aria, the opera, and all sorts of other, and polyester, that's like 5 times as expensive as this technology, which is a company which you literally, you know, we sit at home and we, you know, John and various other people who are in the audience now, you know, we stick the stickers individually on all the things. They come in strips, and it's the cheapest way of doing it. So that's also a consideration, you know. And some of the smells are really standard, like they're you know, they're not specially composed. We got Neil's composed special ones, but the other ones are fairly standard things that we chose from a library. So, you know, that's another consideration, I just have to say.
Given what's going on with COVID-related anosmia, there's a lot of movement to create really cheap smell test delivery. So it may have, you know, an effect on this industry, you know, to make the technology a lot cheaper and better. So stay tuned.
And do you have any thoughts on whether this might become, whether there's any potential for this becoming like a consumer technology, like in terms of people being able to like practice their own micro encapsulations or printing smell onto things like at home, kind of intermediate,
like a 3D printer, you could have a smell printer.
Right, and then you could kind of, you know, there was like the fantasy cool, kind of like in the .com boom, and kind of a few times since then, of being able to send smells over the internet, right? But I'm wondering if, like, thinking of it in terms of just making your own scratch and sniffs at home and then sending them out materially, like by mail, is kind of an intermediary and more practicable step.
Yeah. Or, you know, if everybody has a little smell printer that costs you $69, and all you need to do is add your, you know, 20 chemicals to it, and then you know from this, you know, this new analysis how to make any scent. You can create your own. All you need is the CAD file, basically, to create your own scratch and sniff for whatever show you want to watch.
Bring it on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nadia. I'm going to unpin you, sorry.
Yeah,
Goodbye.
I'm glad to share what little bit I know.
Thank you. And then, okay, so I think we're nearing the end of this. I don't want to keep everyone here over time. Things kind of like started a bit delayed, I guess. But I just wanted to finish up this narrative thread with two questions. They're kind of like each one for Leslie and one for Scott. Scott, is there precedence in like experimental animation where people were given like artifacts to like manipulate during screenings or things like this, or that you're familiar with?
I am not familiar with anything like that.
No,
I don't think there's any precedence. I think I know of some installation and sculpture art that has used smell, but it's much more about kind of placement of materials that will create a strong odor within a space. But it's not necessarily creating an illusion. It's sort of like platforming a particular material. There's an artist named Francis Whitehead based in Chicago that did some interesting installation work using different kind of organically derived jellies that really impacted the space. And she was specifically also using elements that were, thinking about triggering memory. So, but it's totally different medium. But I can't think of any precedents with an animation or film or other film that sort of do what you're describing.
Interesting. And then Leslie, I was curious. So I think like when we talk about visual like film work, we have a sense of units, like frames per second or things like that. Is there anything you could imagine in that vein? I know like for the, what's it called again? The smell identification test from Pennsylvania University, they had like a couple things that could serve as that, but I'm just generally curious. Very open question.
Frame rate, I don't know, but maybe sniff, right? So that the length of a human sniff, it's a number of seconds where, for the rats that we use, they sniff up to 10 times a second, and we're about an order of magnitude slower than that. And so the sniffs, but then delivering the scent. So you also have a perceptual unit, right? So you have to be able to clear the air before you deliver the next scent. So you're kind of looking at it from two perspectives, but I think, on the time frame of a second or a few seconds, I don't think people will notice a change in odor much faster than that, much faster than a couple of seconds, or have time to consider it and identify it and do all those nice things that we need to do to have a perception. If people can be trained to do things much faster, but I think in general, you're dealing with a second or two as a kind of frame rate. But I wanted to get to what you asked, Scott. I mean, one of my favorite, knowledge of a movie that was experiential, but I've never actually experienced, Catherine, maybe you know this movie, The Tingler, which, where they created, it was this little fear creature that lived inside you, and they zapped people in their seats.
Yeah, I can, I've published articles on the Tingler. The Tingler is a loved object of mine. So yes, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But that's another thing that is immersive, engaging, entertaining, but also has these tensions between is it immersive or is it distraction, right? And of course there are all sorts of different ways that audience members navigated the whole device of the Tingler. Some people avoided it by looking under their seats ahead of time. Some people sought it out by looking under their seats ahead of time because only X number of seats per theater were actually kind of motorized to vibrate. And it quickly became The Tingler, as well as most of William Castle's films, quickly developed this really juvenile audience. You know, they were huge hits among teenagers and kids because, as Scott and Tammy both mentioned, it was sort of a ride. You know, it was sort of this ride film to be experienced in a very playful way. So that's kind of what I'll say about the Tingler. But I love the idea of thinking about sniff rate alongside frame rate.
That's nice.
And also, you know, really questioning, probing at what we would want, what directors, producers, actors, anyone involved in the creative process wants the experience of scent and cinema to be, right? Also, that bears into the math of how fast or the sort of pacing of smell, right? If you want it to be a sort of identification experience, as a sort of novelty of seeing a rose and smelling a rose, then I imagine you can move at a much faster sniff rate. But if it's a sort of, you know, Proustian Madeleine experience, you need to slow your sniff rate down in order to allow for that kind of memory experience, that for the narrative of the smell itself to kind of unlock and be processed.
And as an extension of that, you know, Avery Gilbert talks about, you know, what the nose knows, who's an expert in this area, you know, about the importance of having not, you know, the opposite of seeing a rose and smelling a rose, but having a scent cue which doesn't have image or sound attached to it, where you perceive that as part of a narrative separate. You know, that's an extension of narrative in terms, which I'm really interested in. The whole, I hope there are more movies made, but you know, Scent of Mystery was written for smell, as was Whiff. Can I just mention, Jazz, that I don't know how much time we've got left, but Neil Harris, who I've worked with over many years, is just asked if he could chime in with as a co-host. Have we got time?
Yep. So Neil, I made you a co-host and I'm about to pin you. We're going to probably make Neil kind of like our cap off for the event, and then I'll end the event right afterwards.
And can I put a plug in? I'm going to do another link. Catherine, you shared it, but if anyone's interested in Inglorious Smell-O-Vision, the movie we made, which looks at a lot of the history and future of smell, Hans Laub's system, and, you know, a whole lot of practitioners who are participating today. You know, I'll just put the link in there, but, you know, please be in contact with me if you don't know me and you want to know more, because as you know, as you can see, I'm kind of passionate about all this. Scented cinema. Hi, Neil.
Is it to me? Oh, hi there. So
yeah.
as I'm listening to some of the questions and such, we both develop fragrances and we scent events. And scenting an event could be something as simple as scenting the card. It's a very personal event, small, to scenting a phone booth size space or movie theater or even outdoor spaces. So there's various ways to do it. Brew, scratch, and sniff is a very simple, very effective, as we've all kind of seen. So where the fragrance would be encapsulated, there's a few different encapsulation systems, and then you can rub and smell it or scratch and sniff it. It releases it so that you can smell it. Then when we did the Scent of Mystery, which was really kind of fun and interesting, we utilized, I don't know if we used scratch and sniff, but we had atmospheric scent systems where we actually scented some of the big scenes in the show. We scented like the running of the bulls or driving alongside the ocean side. We scented the entire space with the large fan diffusion system, something that we used for theatrical. Those were typically longer scenes where everybody in the audience was going to be completely immersed in it. Then for shorter scenes, we had other things. We had cards where people smelled, and then perfumes and sprayers where we atomized the scent to the air. And we did that for a few. You have to be very careful with that because the scent could land on somebody or go somewhere unintentionally. So a bit harder to control. Some of the challenges and opportunities are being able to control the airflow in theaters. Some theaters, like in a Disney theater, for example, where they're building the theater to incorporate scent, they can control and design the airflow, knowing that scent's going to be part of the experience. But if you're bringing a scent system into a movie theater that's 20, 30, 40 years old, the airflow is what it is. So you've got to somehow bring in a portable system so that you can control that. And you have to think of things such like the frame rate. I'm not experienced in that, but we do know that people inhale and they exhale. You cannot smell anything when you're exhaling. And we've done a lot of experience and testing to see about how long we need to allow for, once the scent is in the neighborhood of the person where they could experience it if they're inhaling, then they can. And seems to be that you need to give somebody about 5 to 7 seconds to exhale and inhale. You don't know, one person may be exhaling sitting next to the other person that's inhaling. They say, oh, I smell it. I didn't smell anything. So the scent may have passed by them so quickly. So all of those factors have to play into the design, along with the proper scent. Somebody may be offended by a particular scent, so you have to think about that. You could do a certain authentic smell that's not so pleasant. Somebody may not like that. So we have to temper all of that into the whole design, thinking about what we're doing. Also, if we want it to be an authentic experience that doesn't seem hokey and fake, that's one aspect of design. Sometimes we may want it to be, hokey, fun, and fake, so that people get that experience. But I think going forward, especially with COVID and some of the things, people are doing a much more entertainment at home. Obviously, there's going to have to be a reason that they go outside once it's safe. And scent the timing of it could be coming up where that offers an experience that you can't quite get at home yet. We're working on systems, all types, that will be at all price points. And that's another thing. And then getting sponsors, companies that are in the scented product business, that make soaps, or they make chocolate, or air fresheners, or candy, or something else, that maybe they'll kick into the budgets to underwrite some of these costs and be involved in the production, so that when the films are being written, scent is written into the script. Then you can really design it with all the factors in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And on that note also, if anyone's curious, there was an episode of My Name is Earl that was sponsored by Oreo, with a scratch and sniff and TV guide. And they indeed have the smell of Oreos in it, from like the 2000s.
Smell.
Yeah, I'm looking for that card. If anyone has it, please talk to me. And also, like, in the history of smell-o-vision, Catherine could probably talk about this more at some point, but we're probably gonna have to end soon. Hans Loeb imagined it especially being used in collaboration with perfume houses to basically kind of have a face associated with it as an incorporated, like, advertisement into the medium itself. So unfortunately, we are basically 15 minutes over.
Can I interrupt just to say, Jazz, you have done such an amazing job. Like, you have worked, like, honestly, Jazz has worked incredibly hard, like, to put this together. It's a big deal, and you've done such a fabulous job. I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're a great collaborator. It's really, really great working with you, and you're so thorough, and, you've done such an amazing job. Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me. I would never have gotten to talk to all these interesting people otherwise. So
thank you. Yeah, so first of all, for everyone who's interested in connecting, I know there's a lot of people that are interested or have more questions. We will send the chat as an additional thing by email for everyone, so they can just, like, scroll back up, see who they were talking to, and so on. This might be also an opportunity for everyone who's interested in receiving emails or sending emails to include their contact information in the chat window, if anyone's interested in that. This is just so that, like, people have that as a record. And then thank you all the panelists, and thank you Neil and Nadia for also surprise joining in the panel. I will release you.
Well, thank you. This was really interesting, just listening and watching the comments and questions of people.
Thank you. Yep. Oh, sorry. I think I interrupted you.
No, that was just a lot of fun.
Okay.
Yeah, this was amazing. And I can't wait to see the future events in the series.
Thank you.
I mean, more than see them.
Smell them.
Smell them too.
Yes. And so right before we leave, I wanted to put a few announcements / plugs. Chach, if you're in the room, you can plug in the Aroma Discord, which is a chat group for people interested in smell and technology, for example. There's the Inglorious Smell-O-Vision documentary that we've already seen. You know how to find all of our panelists in our in the Eventbrite page as well, if you're curious about people's papers or things like that. And then first, we'll be following up with a link to the recorded event for those who might have missed it or want to come back to our discussion. And we'll include the chat as well so people can find their emails or comments. Second, this series is probably going to be sporadic, and we'll be sending a URL with a web page where you can check for future installments if there are some, hopefully, fingers crossed. And then finally, there's going to also be a scented video game series that's going to start February approximately, with things like Leather Goddesses of Phobos and Leisure Suit Larry Love for Sale, and potentially some new games. We'll see. There will also be a link to that for those interested. And so on that note, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you to the panelists for a phenomenal discussion. I loved this. And I have a bazillion more questions, but I'm not going to keep people. And more info will come to your inboxes soon. So yeah, that's the end of today's event.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.